I'm Jim Duff, and I'm the Executive Director of the Supreme Court Historical Society. It's my honor to welcome you today to this virtual lecture delivered by one of the Society's dearest friends. As the pandemic continues and the Supreme Court remains closed, the Society is working hard to make our programs accessible to our members throughout the United States. Today is just one example. While the court building is closed and your staff is working remotely, the Society has not stood still. David Pride, the Society's executive director since 1987, retired at the start of February. His accomplishments and devotion to the Society were legion, and you can find the resolution honoring David on the Society's website. I'm delighted to have been selected to succeed David as the Executive Director of the Supreme Court Historical Society. For me, it's coming full circle. I started my career here in Washington in 1975 as an aide to Chief Justice Warren Burger. And that's when, just about when, he started the Supreme Court Historical Society. So it's just a great honor for me, after spending 45 years in a career throughout Washington in various capacities, to rejoin and link up again with the Supreme Court through the Historical Society. I also served as an aide to Chief Justice Rehnquist as his administrative assistant and counselor to the Chief Justice. And Chief Justice Roberts had appointed me to be director of the administrative office of the courts. So I've had, and I served in that capacity in 12 out of the last 15 years. So I've had wonderful interactions with the court over the years. And as I say, it's a great honor to rejoin the court through the Society. Today's program will feature a talk from Professor Lucas Morel on Lincoln, the founders, and the challenge of self-government. Professor Morel is going to talk for about 30 minutes, and then we'll take questions. Please submit your questions to the chat function on Zoom, and I will be selecting those to share with Professor Morel. I want to say a few words about our wonderful guest speaker today. Lucas Morel is the John Boardman Professor of Politics and the head of politics department at Washington and Lee University. A gorgeous setting in the Shenandoahs. If you haven't been there, you have to visit. He holds a Ph.D. in political science from Claremont Graduate University. Professor Morel also teaches in the master's program in American History and Government at Ashland University in Ohio. He's lectured in summer programs for the Claremont Institute for the Study of Statesmanship and Political Philosophy. And he conducts high school teacher workshops for Gilder Lehrman Institute, John M. Ashbrook Center, Jack Miller Center, Bill of Rights Institute, and Liberty Fund. Professor Morel is the author or editor of Lincoln's Sacred Effort, Defining Religion's Role in American Self-Government, Lincoln and Liberty, Wisdom for the Ages, Ralph Ellison and the Raft of Hope, A Political Companion to Invisible Man, and The New Territory, Ralph Ellison and the 21st Century. His most recent book is Lincoln and the American Founding, published in 2020 for the Concise Lincoln Library Series of Southern Illinois University Press. Professor Morel is the former president of the Abraham Lincoln Institute, a consultant on the Library of Congress exhibits on Lincoln and the Civil War. He was a member of the Scholarly Board of Advisors for the Abraham Lincoln Bicentennial Commission and currently serves on the U.S. Semiquincentennial Commission, which will plan activities to commemorate the founding of the United States of America. From my perspective, most importantly, he is a trustee of the Supreme Court Historical Society. He has spoken at society lectures in the past and is always willing to share his wisdom and guidance. We thank you very much, Lucas, for being with us today.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you, Jennifer Lowe, and all the folks at the Supreme Court Historical Society for the invitation to speak on Lincoln, the founding, and what I call the challenge of self-government. I hope that what I share about Lincoln's view of the Constitution and related constitutional questions, like the relevance of the Declaration of Independence, the problem that race posed to a people long accustomed to slavery, and the challenges a free people face in maintaining a constitutional way of life will help us think through what our country requires of us today. Yes, I still think Lincoln is very much relevant to our times. Now, if they had bumper stickers for the horse and buggy back in Lincoln's day, his carriage would say, "I heart the American founding." In my book, Lincoln and the American Founding, I argued that there was no greater influence on Lincoln's statesmanship than the leading men, and especially the leading ideas that shaped America's revolution and early constitutional formation. Now, you can't talk about the founding without talking about the founder, and that means George Washington. And so in my book, I start with the influence of Washington on Lincoln, Washington's character, his piety, and his indispensable role as a conceiver, defender, and establisher of American self-government. But for Lincoln, more important than a founding man was a founding document, and that would be the Declaration of Independence. Lincoln said on his way to what would be his first inauguration as president that I have never had a feeling politically that did not spring from the sentiments embodied in the Declaration of Independence. And so in chapter 2 of my book, I explore how Lincoln was shaped by key principles of the Declaration and to some extent, its chief draftsman, Thomas Jefferson. Now, if the Declaration spells out the purpose or the aim of the American regime, chapter 3 of my book focuses on the means of American self-government, and these are found in the United States Constitution. I examine why Lincoln preached what he called a reverence for the Constitution and laws, as well as the more perfect union of American states that the Constitution established. Now, of course, you can't read the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence without noticing a few provisions where the Constitution did not align itself completely or consistently with the noble aims of the Declaration. And so in chapter 4, I turn to what Lincoln learned from the founders' compromise or compromises with slavery, the institution that contradicted the founding intentions and experiment in self-government. My last chapter explains Lincoln's understanding of what today we call original intent as a political practice. In short, why follow the founders? This chapter examines how Lincoln understood his own respect for the American founding in light of progress, experience, and the responsibility of each generation to govern themselves under the Constitution in light of the ideals of the Declaration of Independence. Lincoln believed that during his fractious times, looking back to the founding could help Americans move forward. And he did this most famously in his most famous speech, the Gettysburg Address. That speech begins at the nation's beginning, 77 years ago. Our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. If you do the math, you find that he takes his audience back, not to the Constitution, but to the Declaration of Independence, not to the body, but to the soul of the nation. If America stood for anything, it was equality and liberty. Lincoln goes on to explain that the Civil War was a test of America's purpose. As he put it, whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. In the midst of a fight for the very survival of the United States, a civil war, Lincoln thought that the nation would benefit from looking to its past. Americans needed a reminder of why preserving the Union was so important. So Lincoln sought to clarify what was at stake. With Americans shooting not at a foreign enemy, but at each other, it's safe to say that there was some confusion about the meaning of America. Americans were no longer united in their understanding of why their nation existed. What were its highest purposes and aims? So in the middle of a fratricidal war, Lincoln wanted Americans to recommit themselves, to dedicate themselves to the task that remained, to honor the dead who fought at Gettysburg on behalf of the Union by sustaining the effort to preserve the American Union. It was a fight to defend a certain political way of life, what Lincoln called government of the people, by the people, for the people. Now we recall that Lincoln delivered his short speech in the year of Jubilee, the year of emancipation. Union soldiers and sailors were now charged by the president to protect the freedom of over 3 million legally freed Black people. What Lincoln called a new birth of freedom was directly tied to the old, original birth of freedom, our first Emancipation Proclamation, if you will, the Declaration of Independence. Its central idea, according to Lincoln, was that all men are created equal and described the natural condition of all human beings. So at Gettysburg, Lincoln did not announce a new principle of freedom, but affirmed an old one he learned from the founding fathers when they declared independence. Lincoln never sought to discover new rights for a new age. He never spoke of a living constitution per se, where a visionary few would discern what would benefit the many. Instead, he spoke of the unfinished work to which the living, all of the American people, could dedicate themselves. In this way, they could honor the men who fought and died at Gettysburg, those who here gave their lives that the nation might live. Now, this was no Civil War epiphany of Lincoln's. In February 1861, as he headed to the nation's capital to be inaugurated as president, he stopped at the capital of New Jersey in Trenton. And this is what he told the state Senate. He said, "I'm exceedingly anxious that this union, the Constitution, and the liberties of the people shall be perpetuated in accordance with the original idea for which that struggle was made." Now, our temptation today is to think everything new is by definition improved. But in Lincoln's time, there were some Americans arguing for something new and improvement as they understood it over the American founders, and they rejected what Lincoln considered the original idea of American independence. So you consider Alexander Stephens of Georgia, a former Whig colleague of Lincoln's during Lincoln's sole term in Congress. As the vice president of the Confederate States of America, Stephens, argued that their Constitution, the Confederate Constitution, was a better one than the old one Lincoln was trying to preserve. It was better not simply because it protected slavery by mentioning it explicitly, where the original Constitution never even used the word. There were plenty of regimes throughout human history that practiced slavery. But what Alexander Stephens argued was that the Confederacy was the first to base its slave society on a racial principle, white supremacy. Stephens said that the American founders believed, quote, the enslavement of the African was in violation of the laws of nature, that it was wrong in principle, socially, morally, and politically. However, he praised the Confederate Constitution because it was founded upon exactly the opposite idea. Its foundations are laid, its cornerstone rests upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery's subordination to the superior race is his natural and normal condition. And he added, this, our new government, is the first in the history of the world, based upon this great physical, philosophical, and moral truth. Stephens argued that the anti-slavery principles of the founding, in his words, were fundamentally wrong. They rested upon the assumption of the equality of the races. He called this an error, a sandy foundation, unlike the new and improved Constitution that he helped draft for the new Confederate States of America. Nevertheless, in the decade leading up to the Civil War, Lincoln's main political target was not slave-owning Southerners, but complacent white Northerners, especially led by his Illinois rival, Senator Stephen A. Douglas. Lincoln criticized Douglas's notion of popular sovereignty because it was neutral on the slave question. Douglas believed that whites at the local level, whether in the states or federal territories, they had the right to decide the question without interference from Congress. In other words, whether slavery would expand or diminish in the United States under Douglas's definition of popular sovereignty would be determined not by a majority of all American citizens, but by a very small majority of the settlers who went to live in the Western territories. In reference to the enslavement of Black people out West, Douglas had said, "I don't care whether it be voted up or down." This indicated to Lincoln that the greatest obstacle to reducing slavery in the United States was Douglas teaching white Northerners to become indifferent to the plight of Blacks in the federal territories. And this is how Lincoln put it. They tell us that they desire the people of a territory to vote slavery out or in as they please. The question arises, slavery or freedom? Caring nothing about it, they let it come in. And that is the end of it. It is the surest way of nationalizing the institution. Just as certain, but more dangerous because more insidious. It is leading us there just as surely as Jeff Davis himself would have us go. Now, what made Douglas's don't care policy in the territory so insidious was that for slavery to become national, no politician north of the Mason-Dixon line needed to argue in favor of slavery. Following Douglas, simply get white Americans in the free states not to care if Black slavery expanded into federal territory. And once slavery was accepted as a constitutional right in that territory, it would soon become legal, even in the free states, regardless of what their laws or constitution said. In his debates with Douglas in 1858, Lincoln warned that popular sovereignty, coupled with the recent Dred Scott opinion, would produce precisely this outcome in the not too distant future. By straying from its original commitment to human equality, America was becoming a country Lincoln no longer recognized. And so he called upon our revolutionary fathers for aid. Looking back to the founders couldn't have been more relevant to the crisis the nation faced in the 1850s. And Lincoln wasn't the only one appealing to the fathers. Stephen Douglas was the leading Democrat and therefore the leading politician throughout the decade of the 1850s. And Douglas claimed that he knew better than Lincoln what the founders thought on the question of slavery. Douglas claimed his policy aligned more closely with the founders' intentions for the new republic. In Lincoln's mind, the future of freedom and the eventual demise of slavery depended on whose interpretation of the founders was correct and could best unite a divided country and eventually get rid of slavery. Lincoln argued that the founding of the United States, at that founding, slavery was viewed and treated as a necessary evil. But it had become in the slaveholding states, to quote South Carolina Senator John C. Calhoun, a positive good. The founders also agreed that where slavery already existed in the states, Congress would have no authority over that institution because of the federal nature of the United States Constitution. Slavery was at that time considered a domestic institution and therefore governed mostly by state authority. Since the beginning of the United States, the powers of government were divided between the state governments and the national government. And because slavery existed prior to the formation of the United States, it remained a state institution. If the states themselves didn't abolish it, it could not be abolished by Congress, short of a constitutional amendment, followed by ratification by the states. Now, with the population growing faster in the free states than in the slaveholding states, The future of slavery was going to be decided by the votes of white Northerners. Lincoln believed that Congress did have authority to ban slavery in the only land possessed by the American people at large, and that was the federal territories. However, tempted by Stephen Douglas's notion of popular sovereignty, slavery's fate might be determined not by moral right, but by mere self-interest, meaning those who could profit by taking Black slaves into the territories. But if white Northerners agreed with Douglas that Congress did not have authority to regulate the domestic affairs of the territories, then Douglas's declared indifference, his don't care policy, in Lincoln's mind would actually represent covert real zeal for the spread of slavery. And so Lincoln was at pains to tie the future security of the rights of white people to the present insecurity of the rights of Black people. Those same white Americans would have to decide if what happened to people that did not look like them, enslaved Blacks in the South, potentially being taken into federal territory, had anything to do with the kind of country that they wanted to live in. For Lincoln, the necessary connection could be found not only in the thinking, but also the practice of the American founders. Now, a case in point is the Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1854, which opened both territories of Kansas and Nebraska north of the 3630 parallel to the possibility of slavery. This act contradicted the Missouri Compromise of 1820, which actually banned slavery from that very territory. Lincoln pointed out that the founding generation, as well as generations that followed in the early republic, acted to restrict the expansion of slavery in the United States. They did so by banning slavery in the Northwest Territory in 1787, and they stopped the importation of slaves in 1808, all in hopes of putting slavery, as Lincoln said, in the course of ultimate extinction. Lincoln lamented how the nation had departed from its original approach to abolishing the pre-existing institution of slavery in a gradual, peaceful manner. And this is how he put it. He said, the plain, unmistakable spirit of that age towards slavery was hostility to the principle and toleration only by necessity. But now it is to be transformed into, scare quotes, a sacred right. Nebraska brings it forth, places it on the high road to extension and perpetuity. Little by little, but steadily, as man's march to the grave, we have been giving up the old for the new faith. The new faith was Stephen Douglas's perversion of true popular sovereignty. His was a crude majoritarianism that rejected the self-evident truth that all men are created equal and made the rights of Black people depend on the arbitrary will of local white majorities. Lincoln rejected this legal positivism and preached a return to what he called our ancient faith, the faith of the fathers. Our Republican robe is soiled and trailed in the dust, Lincoln declared. Let us repurify it. Let us turn and wash it white in the spirit, if not the blood of the revolution. Let us turn slavery from its claims of moral right back upon its existing legal rights and its arguments of necessity. Let us return it to the position our fathers gave it, and there, pun alert, let it rest in peace. Lincoln charged Americans to readopt the Declaration of Independence. In so doing, they would not have only saved the Union, but as he put it, so saved it as to make and keep it forever worthy of the saving. That was October 1854. A country worthy of the saving needed to be a country that limited the spread of slavery as a first step to its eventual demise. In short, a don't care policy was not worthy of Lincoln's generation of Americans because it was not worthy of the fathers of the American Republic. In December of 1860, Abraham Lincoln, or President-elect Abraham Lincoln, he received a letter from none other than Alexander Stephens, who would soon become the vice president of the Confederacy. Stephens wanted Lincoln to speak to the nation before his March 4th inauguration. In his words, to save our common country. Quoting Proverbs 25, Stephens suggested to Lincoln that a word fitly spoken by you now would be like apples of gold in pictures of silver. This prompted Lincoln to jot a note to himself, a reflection on what he called the philosophical cause of American prosperity. For someone who had long revered the Constitution and saw the union of the American states as essential to the success of the Republic, Lincoln wrote that even these are not the primary cause of our great prosperity. His note continued, there is something back of these, entwining itself more closely about the human heart. That something is the principle of liberty to all, the principle that clears the path for all, gives hope to all, and by consequence, enterprise and industry to all. And then Lincoln, again, in this note to himself, alluded to the proverb that Stephens cited. The assertion of that principle at that time was the word fitly spoken, which has proved an apple of gold to us. The Union and the Constitution are the picture of silver, subsequently framed around it. The picture was made not to conceal or destroy the apple, but to adorn and preserve it. The picture was made for the apple, not the apple for the picture. What the country needed in Lincoln's mind was not a new word from their new president, but old words, the words of their forefathers expressed in the Declaration of Independence. Lincoln saw the Declaration's principle of liberty to all, the equal rights possessed by all human beings, as the moral compass of a constitution and union that could otherwise be misinterpreted or even broken in pursuit of tyrannical ends. Like the founders, Lincoln believed that but for the American Union, there would be no freedom for whites or blacks. This was not an innovation on Lincoln's part, but rather an abiding conviction of Americans who knew their colonial and revolutionary history. Liberty on American soil required political independence from foreign powers, Mother England, and independence required unity among the American colonies. To maintain that American Union required that compromises be made, especially regarding slavery. Lincoln said, I think that was the condition in which we found ourselves when we established this government. We had slavery among us. We could not get our Constitution unless we permitted them to remain in slavery. We could not secure the good we did secure if we grasped for more. And having by necessity submitted to that much, it does not destroy the principle that is the charter of our liberties. Time and again, Lincoln's references to the founders centered on how they tried to establish a government based on human equality, but by that very equality had imposed upon themselves a moral necessity to abolish slavery in a manner consistent with the consent that was the flip side of the equality coin. As he put it late in the war, if slavery is not wrong, nothing is wrong. I cannot remember when I did not so think and feel. Yet, I have never understood that the presidency conferred upon me an unrestricted right to act officially upon this judgment and feeling. This distinction between official duty and personal wish, a distinction Lincoln made most famously in his 1862 public letter to Horace Greeley before he issued the Emancipation Proclamation, demonstrates most clearly Lincoln's concern that Americans follow the rule of law in their pursuit of justice. With the draft of the Emancipation Proclamation in his pocket in 1862, Lincoln said to Greeley, "My paramount object in this struggle is to save the Union, and is not either to save or to destroy slavery. If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that. In America, the means of securing liberty needs to be consistent with the end. To emancipate slaves, as president in a time of war, Lincoln had to turn a humanitarian end into a constitutional means. This way, emancipation would be a just act of the federal government, that is, a legitimate expression of the consent of the American people. In looking to the founders, Lincoln believed Americans could find clarity about the true principles of self-government, and thus common ground for promoting a common future as a truly free, self-governing people. Lincoln belongs to the ages as a teacher of profound lessons regarding the challenge of living as a self-governing people. Lincoln became a statesman by looking to the founders and making the case that what they achieved was the most prudent and therefore the best means of securing their safety and happiness. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lucas. That was fascinating. Your students at WNL are very fortunate indeed.
Thanks.
We're going to take some questions from the audience. And if you have questions, please type them into the chat and we'll get to as many of them as possible. I'll start off with one as they come in. Do you think that President Lincoln learned anything from the founders that we could apply or address today and the political polarization that we're experiencing today? I know it's been described as we've never been so polarized as since the Civil War.
Yeah.
But what do you think Lincoln may have learned that would be helpful today?
I think I can think of a two-part answer to that question. One has to deal with the meaning of this country. In other words, what is the purpose of America? I think at a time of great turmoil and division, the 1850s in America, that was worse than today. Lincoln thought that the one sure way that we ought to unify ourselves was something he learned from the founding. In other words, why there was a founding to begin with. He thought the principles in the Declaration were not like peculiarly American. He thought they were universal, that he thought they applied to all human beings everywhere throughout time. And therefore, the only way you could get self-government to work is if everybody bought into those principles and saw those, what the founders called self-evident truths, as true not just for them, but for everyone. It can't be freedom for me and not for thee. And so he said in 1854, when he saw the country veering off of that intention through Stephen Douglas and his popular sovereignty policy, he thought we have to re-adopt the Declaration. In other words, we've got to relearn this thing that maybe we learned by rote, but we never really sat down and thought through what the meaning was and its implications. And so I think we need to recover a declaration approach to understanding our rights. That rights aren't something that are wed to any particular race or sex or nationality or religion, but something that is common to our humanity. And so to have a common country, we need to have a common understanding of ourselves as fellow citizens. And so thinking of the natural rights basis of our civil and political rights, I think that would be a start. And the second part would be, if those are the ends of the regime, the means, as I mentioned in my talk, the means have to be consistent with our ends. And so if all rights are possessed by every individual, right? The minority of one in this country is the most important minority. The rights of that individual, every single one. We have to get back to an understanding of thinking of majority rule in this country as a rule that is legitimated by elections, to be sure. It expresses the consent of the governed. But that majority will must be directed to the protection of that which all of us possess. And so that way we don't look at Supreme Court appointments or presidential elections or congressional ones for that matter as simply a way of getting into power and then protecting our own or getting stuff for our people. We have to, as I've put it in some other writings and speeches, we have to get back to the understanding of republics being republics and their elections producing good winners and good losers. When Lincoln was elected, it was incumbent upon him to show that he would be a good winner. That was the onus or the burden of the first inaugural address. And the burden of the losers were to be obeying what this new administration and Congress would do. In 1856, the Republicans lost. They didn't secede. They were good losers, but they kept trying to shape public opinion so they could become a majority. The problem in 1860, to wrap this up, was a certain portion of the Democrats, the Breckinridge Southern portion, said, no, it's got to be our way or no, heads we win, tails you lose. So they became, as it were, poor losers, bad losers. And they said, because our guy didn't win, we get to leave. And Lincoln said, no, that's un-American. That subverts the Republican principle, small r, and we can't have that.
Thank you. That's fascinating observations. You mentioned that, of course, the President Lincoln favored the abolition of slavery. Was he an abolitionist?
Oh, yeah, that's kind of a logical question. If you favor abolition, are you an abolitionist? Interestingly enough, and this is something that takes some time to persuade my students of, that no, Lincoln was not an abolitionist in spite of the fact that he had anti-slavery convictions and wanted slavery to be abolished. What's the difference? At the time, late 1830s, 40s, and 50s, abolitionists had gotten a reputation for two things: an absolute conviction about the immediate emancipation, most of them, immediate emancipation of slaves. But the other thing they were known for was they didn't care how it happened. And so you get guys like the most famous abolitionist of the time, William Lloyd Garrison, who called the Constitution a covenant with death and an agreement with hell. You always knew where you stood with William Lloyd Garrison. And that was his way of saying, you either agree with us, and if the Constitution makes compromises with slavery, then in his mind, literally to hell with the Constitution. We don't have to, it's not incumbent upon us to persuade you that we're correct. We are correct. And this is something that should happen right away. Lincoln stayed away from that. He did not want to be known as an abolitionist because he had too great a respect for the Constitution, did not believe it was a pro-slavery Constitution the way Garrison thought it was. In 1854, Garrison actually burned a copy of the Constitution at a public rally. That's the kind of guy you did not invite to your parties. And so abolitionists, it's hard for us to think about this today because it seems obvious, because it is. Slavery is wrong. But at the time, they were seen as promoting a good end through subversive means. And so Lincoln believed in the rule of law, believed in the consent of the governed so much that he thought how we get to abolition is as important that we get there. And so under a federal constitution, slavery was a local institution and had to be treated as such. Congress couldn't touch it there, but could, if it chose to, touch it in the federal territories. And that, in fact, was what birthed the Republican Party in the mid-1850s.
Thank you. I'm going to read from some from the chat
Sure.
room. Do you feel that President Lincoln limited the Emancipation Proclamation to states in rebellion because that was his legal authority while at war?
Yes, the great thing about the Emancipation Proclamation is it doesn't just proclaim freedom. It explains why a president can proclaim freedom. And Lincoln, if you will, he realized it wasn't just issuing public letters like the one I quoted from to Horace Greeley. They didn't have press conferences at the time. You would just issue these public letters and occasionally give a speech. Lincoln recognized that not only did he have to talk the nation up to seeing emancipation as constitutionally legitimate, he actually included that kind of language in both the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, September 22nd, 1862, when he announced that he was going to emancipate 100 days from now, i.e. January 1st, 1863. And then he argued again, explained what authority he had, right? President of the United States, commander in chief, in a time of actual rebellion against federal authority. For all those reasons, Lincoln explained, these certain places in the United States, I believe I have authority to treat this local legal property as if it was illegitimate, and therefore they are entitled to their freedom and will be protected in their freedom. Okay. So Lincoln explained that authority in the actual Emancipation Proclamation. And therefore, I mean, people glibly, not just today, but at the time thought, gee, Lincoln, you're freeing slaves where you don't apparently have power, and you're keeping them enslaved when you do have, where you do have power. But they misunderstood the constitutionality of slavery. So in Kentucky, Missouri, Delaware, and Maryland, those were states where the citizens remained loyal to the Constitution, and therefore Lincoln, as president, was bound as president to protect their property no less than the governors of those states. It was only in the states where the citizens had claimed to have seceded, where they were disobeying, resisting the federal government and federal authority. Only there, in a time of war, did Lincoln believe he had authority. In other words, the American people had consented and therefore delegated to give him authority as commander-in-chief to do what it took to win a war. And that's why I said he turned this humanitarian end, freedom, into a constitutional means, a means to preserving union, which was clearly spelled out in the Constitution in order to justify it.
Interesting. Did the average industrial worker in the North favor abolition, considering that freeing the enslaved would result in more industrial job competition?
That's a very specific question, and we didn't have Gallup polls back then, so I can't answer with 100% confidence, but I will say this. And this was actually shown in a number of movies starring Lincoln of late. There were draft riots in the North and New York in particular, where Blacks were massacred by recent immigrants in particular because of the fear that they would be competing for jobs in New York in particular. It was in fact soldiers from the recent Gettysburg battle that were spirited up to New York to put down those riots by white Americans there running roughshod over Black Americans. So in terms of industrial workers, unfortunately, and at least with some plausibility on their part, it had long been a two-part question with regards to abolition or emancipation. Even among those who favored abolition, the question was, A, how should we abolish slavery? And then B, what happens to the formerly enslaved? One fear was that they would immediately be placed on welfare rolls because there wouldn't be jobs for them. Where would they live? All these sorts of things, right? And so a great hindrance to emancipation was, in fact, this fear of competition from new free labor, which had formerly been enslaved labor. And so I think it is safe to say that there was some sense among, and I wouldn't just say industrial workers, I would just say workers, wage laborers is, I think, a better way of putting it, that there was some palpable fear or concern that 3 to 4 million Black people are going to leave the location of their former masters, their enemies, especially after a war, and go north and west. And what's going to happen at that point? And that unfortunately complicated emancipation. It complicated the transition from the antebellum slave society that many of the states were prior to the Civil War in the United States into an entirely free republic. So I think that was a palpable concern. But interestingly enough, and the great Civil War historian James McPherson has pointed this out in a book called For Cause and Comrades. He read thousands of diaries and letters, and he noticed that at the beginning of the war, it was clear that if you polled them, most white supporters and soldiers in the Union war effort didn't care about Black people and did not want to fight in what was known as an abolition war. But as they made their way south and west, and as they encountered the enslaved and encountered their conditions of living and their hardships, they became converts, not to a man, to be sure, but more and more of them started writing back home and going, you won't believe what we have seen. Slavery down here really is as bad as the claims have been. And as emancipation approached in late 1862 and 63, you see more of these letters and diaries by Northern or by Union soldiers and sailors condemning the institution and no longer saying we're not going to fight to free Black people.
At the time of the Declaration of Independence, were there any of the original states that did not have a slave-based industry or that advocated against slavery at the time of the Declaration?
Certainly prior to the United States Constitution, right, 1787, 88, slavery was legal in every state. Massachusetts was the first to produce a new constitution during the Revolution, 1780. And in that constitution, they had a Declaration of Rights, which said all men are born free and equal, right? Cribbing from the Declaration. And what you have in between 1781 and 83, a series of petitions, and more importantly, lawsuits initiated by slaves themselves. In Massachusetts, the statutes actually permitted slaves to sue in court. And what usually happened is they were suing because they were harmed by their master. A law was violated and they could sue for damages or for their freedom, but it didn't abolish slavery. But between 1781 and 1783, two slaves in particular, one known as Mumbet or Elizabeth Freeman, as she called herself, and another slave called Quack Walker, they sued for their freedom, not on the basis of harm per se, but on the basis of the Massachusetts Constitution. The Constitution, written by white people, said all men, and at that time that meant all humans, all men are born free and equal. So they looked and said, I count, where do I sign? I'm born free and equal. What's up, Massachusetts? And a judge said, did we really say that? No. A judge read the Constitution, the plain language, and said, you're right. And so in 2 to 3 years, slavery, not by law, but by court edict, was abolished. Notice, not just enslaved this or that person, but the actual institution was abolished. Now, in the other 5 of the original 13, right, 6 of the original 13 banned slavery. There's, in those states, New York did this in 1799, they promulgated statutes of gradual emancipation, and that usually involved apprenticeships. They were enslaved, depending on sex, to they were apprenticed for a certain number of years. And so then when they reached the age of 18 or 21 or 25, they would become free. But notice it happened gradually. And that was in their minds, a prudential way of absorbing this new population that hitherto had not been free wage laborers, but enslaved. Already forgetting your question, but it had to do with how legal was slavery. I think in the original 13, it was for a good while during the Revolution, it was legal in all of them. But over time, if you will, I would argue that the principles of the Declaration, the principles of the Revolution, what Lincoln called the spirit of 76, made its way, percolated its way into the American population to a point where they realized that they had at least a moral obligation, if they were going to live according to these principles, to get rid of slavery, as Lincoln put it, as soon as circumstances shall permit.
This is great, Lucas. You're so knowledgeable and helpful. And we have more questions, but I'm sort of new at this format. But I was told at the outset, I think I was to wrap up questions at 12:45. We're already 5 minutes beyond that, and
take a couple more.
That's great with me if you're up for it. It's just a fascinating presentation. Did President Lincoln already have a reverence for the founders, or do you think it, by already, I assume the questioner means prior to his engagement with the Civil War and as president, but did he already have that reverence, or was it developed over time?
Well, I think it's fair to say that there was a commonplace reverence for the founders in Lincoln's, certainly by Lincoln's time, and we'll trace it even before he comes to true political prominence in the 1850s. Certainly by the 1820s and 30s, it was commonplace for people, regardless of regardless of the diversity of opinions they held about political policies and laws. Nobody said, oh, we can do better than the founders, let's do this. They all made their arguments, even those who were making the argument for slavery as a positive good. They all made their arguments on the basis of what they called our revolutionary fathers. Everyone tied it somehow, even a toenail hold on the founders. And so Lincoln, yes, was a part of that. But his first great speech is delivered in 1838. It's known as the Perpetuation Address or the Lyceum Address. And it's a speech entirely devoted to how do you keep a democracy? How do you keep a republic going? Is it this eternal motion, perpetual motion machine? Turns out it isn't. And in that, Lincoln, and the only time he uses this phrase, he says he preaches a political religion. And what is that political religion? Reverence for the Constitution and laws. And in that speech, for the most part, there's a particular qualification that would take me time to spell out, which we don't have, but for the most part, Lincoln is all praise of the founders. The concluding paragraph is, this ode to George Washington. And so he is definitely in the founders' basket with both feet, certainly when he becomes a state politician in the 1830s. And this is something that grows and deepens in some clearly profound ways by the time he returns to politics in the 1850s, and at that point at the national level.
We're going to try to bring you back, Lucas. We have so many questions and they're all good ones. I hate to cut it short. Maybe one more.
Good.
All right. And then we'll try to get you back for another session.
Sure.
Fascinating. Could you talk about the views of Vice President Johnson, later President Johnson, as you know, and Ulysses Grant about continuing the vision of President Lincoln?
Wow.
Equality. I mean,
that deserves a speech unto itself, one that I have never given, but I teach on to some extent. Short version. There's this great quote by Frederick Douglass where he said, Andrew Johnson came in as Moses and went out as Pharaoh. And what had happened was that Johnson spoke to a predominantly Black audience at one point, and this was early in his presidency. And he heard these catcalls from the audience basically saying, maybe not catcalls, but he heard them saying, be our Moses, right? They had lost their great emancipator, Abraham Lincoln, now the VP from a slave state, Tennessee, but he was loyal, right? He's the only senator from a seceding state who showed up for work in DC. He didn't go with his state and later became a military governor. And so Johnson said, sure, I'll be your Moses. Now, of course, we discovered fairly soon after Lincoln's assassination that Johnson, he hated two things: Southern elite plantation owners and slaveholders and Black people. He thought Black people were not created equal. He thought they were naturally inferior, certainly by condition. Was explicit about this in State of the Union addresses and veto message. He was explicit about Blacks not deserving the right to vote, certainly not in the early period of Reconstruction. And so in that regard, he's the antithesis of Lincoln, even though he used the rhetoric of Lincoln, the mantle of Lincoln, the garb to coat his policies. Lincoln preferred the term restoration rather than reconstruction, and Johnson ran with that. He would talk about the restoration of federal authority, but to what end should that authority be put? I would argue he differed with Abraham Lincoln. Grant, and he gets, I mean, I'm glad there's this boomlet of Grant biographies now. Grant, we need to know more about Grant today, because but for Grant and his determination to do right by what were known at the time as the freedmen and freedwomen, Reconstruction would have been even a worse failure than it managed to be. Grant insisted on having federal troops, and the only way you were going to have the peaceful exercise of civil and political rights by Black people in the South was through federal military occupation. There was no alternative, and that, of course, required money, and it required men to do that. And while Grant was president, that happened. Now, there was the Colfax Massacre and other horrific events and episodes that happened during Grant's administration because the federal government was stretched thin in terms of where you put soldiers and federal judges and courts so that Blacks could sue for their rights, et cetera. But Grant did what he could, but ultimately a depression and of course the Hayes-Tilden Compromise removed what the South considered bayonet rule. And once the military left, Blacks by the millions were at the mercy of their former oppressors. And unfortunately, that is what produced the failure of Reconstruction that we know today. There were some successes, of course. Blacks were elected at the local, state, and federal level. But in the end, of course, it wasn't until, can you imagine this? It wasn't until 90 years later do we get significant civil rights legislation, what we know as the Civil Rights Act of 64 and the Voting Rights Act of 65. And that's 90 years after the end of the Civil War. I mean, remarkable how long it took for at least what Lincoln hoped would happen as a result of the end of the Civil War with a successful Union victory. It took almost a century for that to pan out. And that just shows you how pervasive the resistance was in the South.
Well, I can't think of a better lunch hour that I've spent. This is wonderful. You're great to have done it, Lucas. And I think we're going to have to ask you to come back because I can't get to all the questions that have been posted. It's obviously stimulated a lot of thought, and that's the purpose of these. It's a great format. I hope you all have enjoyed it. I want to remind you that signed copies of Lucas's book are available from the Historical Society's gift shop. You can find it at www.supremecourtgifts.org. It's as thoughtful a read as this lunch hour presentation suggests. Highly recommend it to you. And because this is a new format, for our society and our members, we're going to send out a survey later this afternoon to everyone who registered in advance. And we hope you respond to it. And we'd like to make these programs as informative and accessible to as many people as possible. And we hope to bring Lucas back for another. It's been such a useful time for us all, I hope. For more information about the Society and for future events, please visit our website at www.supremecourthistory.org. And again, the book you can get from supremecourtgifts.org. Thank you all for joining us very much, and a very special thank you to you, Lucas.
Thank you. Thanks, Jim.
You bet.